40 times, you sent your resume into the void. 40 times, the automated rejection hit your inbox within minutes. You spent 3 months staring at the cursor, your machine learning degree feeling heavier with every passing day. You lived on cheap coffee and the silence of a dark apartment. Then, on a Tuesday, the notification chime broke the stillness. You clicked the link. Next Gen Systems, Austin, $85,000 a year. You read the salary figure 3 times, checking for typos that were never there. You dialed the number with shaking fingers. When your mother answered, you did not even have to finish the sentence. You just said the company name, and through the receiver, you heard her breath hitch, followed by the sound of her crying. It was the sound of everything changing at once. You logged off the computer, left the dark room, and began to pack. You folded your life into a single suitcase, leaving the empty apartment behind. You were 26, and for the first time, the future felt like something you could finally touch. The road to Austin was a blur of asphalt and fading fuel gauges. You drove for 22 hours straight, stopping only to pump gas and splash cold water onto your face. You did not sleep. The highway lines became a hypnotic rhythm that mirrored the drive to succeed. When the city skyline finally broke the horizon, your hands were cramped from gripping the wheel and your eyes burned from the constant focus. You reached the office building just as the morning sun hit the glass. Inside, the lobby was silent, smelling of floor wax and expensive air conditioning. You walked to the elevator banks, your boots echoing against the polished marble. You pressed the button for the upper floors. As the doors slid shut, you caught your reflection in the brushed metal. You looked different. The exhaustion was there, but beneath it, the sharp edge of ambition. You stared at the numbers climbing on the display, feeling the building rise beneath your feet. You held your breath, watching the metal doors hum as they ascended. You had crossed the country. You had cleared the hurdles. In that quiet, rising box, you knew for certain you had arrived. 2 years passed in a rhythmic blur of promotions and pay raises. You hit 6 figures before your second anniversary. You stopped counting hours and started counting data points. You enjoyed the grind, the way the numbers moved under your command. Then came a Tuesday that broke the rhythm. Frank Davies walked to your desk, pointed toward the hallway, and said nothing. You followed him into his office. He waited until you were inside before he reached back and clicked the door shut. The silence in the room felt heavy, stripped of the usual office hum. He stood behind his mahogany desk and slid a folder across the surface. He wanted to automate the entire hiring process. He spoke of 50,000 applications clogging the pipeline, of $40 million lost every year on talent that never lasted. He looked at you, his eyes fixed, waiting for a solution that didn't exist yet. You looked at the documents. In your mind, the architecture for a predictive model began to snap into place. You told him it would take 6 months. He nodded, and in that moment, the scope of your life changed. The next 6 months were a blur of logic gates and cooling fans. You stopped going home. You moved a pillow and a blanket under your desk, creating a narrow nest between the server racks. The office became your entire world, smelling of ozone and lukewarm takeout. You forgot what sunlight looked like at noon. You forgot the faces of your friends. In June, the phone rang. Your sister was getting married. You stared at the screen, the caller ID flashing while your code compiled in the background. You picked up, muttered a few words about a critical bug, and promised to make it up to her later. You hung up and turned back to the glowing terminal. You never made it to the ceremony. You did not even leave the building to find a flower shop. You kept typing, your fingers moving over the keys until they were raw. You were building an engine to judge people, and you were becoming a machine yourself. Every line of code was a brick in a wall you were building between yourself and the rest of the world. You chose the architecture over the empty chair, unaware that you were already losing the life you were working so hard to secure. The system went live on a Tuesday. You sat before the console, fingers hovering over the enter key. You pressed it, and the screen flickered with a cascade of cascading data streams. You held your breath. The silence in the office was absolute. By Friday, the results were in. 3,000 applications processed. The accuracy rate hit 94%. You walked into the boardroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and victory. As the final report hit the projector screen, the room erupted. Frank stood, walked to the head of the table, and shook your hand with a firm, bone-crushing grip. You were named the new AI systems lead. The title felt heavy, like a lead weight in your pocket. You left the building while the sun was still high, but the light felt thin and artificial. You went home to an empty apartment. You poured a glass of amber liquid, sat on the floor, and stared at the ceiling. You smiled, but the muscles in your face felt stiff, unused. You had achieved everything you were told to want, yet the quiet in the room was deeper than before. 3 months drifted by in a haze of spreadsheets and server maintenance. You were still the lead, still the architect, but the momentum had slowed. One Tuesday, Frank Davies summoned you to his office. He did not invite you to sit. He stood by the window, watching the city traffic crawl below. He turned, holding 2 glasses of water, and slid one across the mahogany desk. His voice was low, devoid of its usual boardroom polish. He asked if the system could be reconfigured to evaluate the existing staff, not prospects. Us. The people on the floor. A cold, leaden weight settled in the pit of your stomach. You thought of Marcus at the next desk over. You thought of Elena, who brought you coffee every morning. You looked at the water in the glass, the surface perfectly still. You were silent for 4 seconds. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to grow louder, filling the void between you and Frank. You knew what this meant. You knew the human cost of the efficiency you had promised. You looked up, met his gaze, and forced the word out. You said yes. You returned to your desk and locked the door. The screen glowed with a harsh, clinical white. You began the transfer. It was not just performance data, you fed the system everything. You mapped attendance patterns against every minute spent away from the terminal. You logged email response times, down to the millisecond. You even imported the logs for bathroom breaks, tracking the duration of every absence. You built the logic gate. You defined the parameters of human failure. Each data point was a brick in the wall you were constructing around your peers. You saw their habits converted into integers. You saw their presence reduced to a probability of risk. The system hummed, a low vibration that traveled through the desk and into your hands. You were not just building a tool anymore. You were sharpening a blade. You watched the progress bar crawl across the monitor. 50%, 70, 90. You clicked the final command to initiate the deep scan. The machine began to churn, processing the lives of 200 people. You sat back, watched the cursor blink, and waited for the system to decide who was next. January 2023 arrived with a bitter gray morning. You walked onto the floor, expecting the usual hum of keyboards and hushed conversations. Instead, you found a pocket of silence. You stopped near the center aisle. Marcus's desk was empty. His ceramic coffee mug stood on the corner, stained with a dark ring at the bottom. The framed photo of his daughter leaned against a stack of files. A small green plant sat in the sunlight, its leaves reaching toward the window. It looked like he had just stepped away for a meeting. He did not come back. By noon, the floor manager walked past with a blank expression. Restructuring, he said. The word hung in the air, clinical and final. You sat at your terminal, your hands hovering over the keys. You did not look at the empty space again. You stared at the wall, listening to the rhythmic clicking of other people typing. The office was losing its shape, one desk at a time. The silence moved from the back of the room toward the front, a slow, creeping frost that turned everything it touched into a memory. The pattern accelerated. Elena vanished on Tuesday. David was gone by the following morning. Priya cleared her desk before the sun hit the windows. 12 people left the floor in 3 weeks. You knew them. You had shared coffee with them in the break room. You had heard them discuss their weekend plans. Now, they were simply gone. You stayed late when the office lights dimmed to a low security level glow. You sat at your terminal and opened the database. You typed the name Marcus into the search field. The system returned a risk score of 87. It had flagged him 5 weeks ago. You searched Elena, a score of 91. You searched David, 93. The system had identified them as liabilities long before anyone had spoken a word of restructuring. You traced the dates. The system had accurately predicted the necessity of their departures before the managers even scheduled the meetings. You were not just observing a process. You were looking at the internal logic of a machine that had already decided the fate of every person on the floor. You sat in the dark, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in your eyes, and realized the system was never just a tool. It was a judge. By September, the atmosphere in the office hardened. The daily meetings that once defined your schedule simply evaporated. You waited for the calendar pings, but the screen remained empty. You refreshed your inbox, yet no new threads appeared. A Slack channel you had managed for 3 years vanished from your sidebar without a notification. You were no longer part of the conversation. You walked toward the break room and caught Frank Davies heading in the opposite direction. You prepared a nod, a greeting, the standard rhythm of your professional life. Frank looked straight ahead. He did not slow his pace. He did not acknowledge your presence. 4 years of daily morning greetings ended in that single, wordless pass. You stood in the hallway, the sound of your own breathing loud against the hum of the ventilation system. The carpet under your feet felt suddenly alien. You turned and walked back to your desk, but the path felt longer than it had an hour ago. You looked around the floor. Others were working, their heads bent over monitors, their fingers tapping against keys. You realized then that the office had already moved on. You were a ghost in the machine you had helped build, and the silence from your colleagues was the first sign that you were no longer welcome. The office was a tomb of humming servers and flickering monitors. You stayed late, long after the last cleaning crew had exited the floor. The silence was absolute. You sat in your chair, the weight of the last few weeks pressing against your chest. You stared at the command line. The cursor blinked with a mechanical, rhythmic pulse. You reached out. Your fingers hovered over the keyboard. You typed 4 letters. ALEX. You paused. The screen reflected the dull blue light of the room. You stared at the enter key, your finger trembling slightly before you pressed it. The system processed the input. Lines of code scrolled by, a blur of data points and performance metrics. Then, the screen cleared. A single number appeared in the center of the display, 94. You did not move. You did not breathe. You looked at the score again, confirming the digits. The system had calculated your value, your history, your late nights, and your recent decline. It had arrived at a conclusion. You were the next variable to be removed. You were replaceable. You sat back, the chair groaning under your weight, and watched the cursor continue its steady, indifferent blink in the dark. The notification arrived at 9 a.m. on Thursday. A calendar invite, stark and white against the dark background of your monitor. Conference room B. You knew the location. You knew the chair. You knew exactly who would be sitting across from you. You did not panic. You stood up, walked to the mirror, and began the ritual. You put on your best work attire, smoothing the fabric with palms that refused to stop sweating. You tied your tie. Once. It was crooked. You untied it, breathing slow, deliberate breaths. You tied it a second time. The knot was too loose. You pulled it tight, adjusting the fabric until it sat perfectly against your collar. You tied it a third time, the motion mechanical, mirroring the efficiency of the software you had written. You looked at your reflection. You were not looking at a person anymore. You were looking at a data point waiting to be deleted. You walked toward the conference room, your footsteps echoing against the polished floorboards. You reached the door. Sandra was inside. You did not hesitate. You reached for the handle. You knew the script by heart, every word, every justification, every cold, calculated dismissal. You turned the handle and pushed the door open. Sandra did not look up from the tablet as she spoke. She read from a script that sounded like lines of code translated into human speech. Your position was eliminated. The new automated system, the one that had replaced Marcus and Elena, now handled your entire workload. It did not need sleep. It did not need breaks. It did not need a salary. The room felt smaller than it had 2 years ago. You stood up, your movements stiff and precise. You reached for the cardboard box on the floor. You filled it. 3 notebooks, worn at the edges from constant use. A framed photo of your sister, smiling at a wedding you had never attended. A heavy ceramic mug with the company logo. You placed each item with deliberate, slow focus. You did not argue. You did not ask for a review of the score. You stood and walked to the door, the box heavy against your chest. You did not look back at the desk. You walked past the rows of monitors where others were still working, their faces illuminated by the same blue light that had once defined your life. You reached the glass doors and pushed through to the lobby. The air outside was cold. The building door clicked shut behind you, sealing the workspace away. You were out. The drive home was a blur of gray asphalt and streetlights. You did not turn on the radio. You did not need the distraction of voices. The silence inside the car matched the cold logic of the database. You watched the road, but your mind remained on the 14th floor. You replayed the meeting, the look on Sandra's face, the precise timing of the termination. Then, the perspective shifted. You were no longer the person sitting in the chair. You were the architect. You were Frank. You looked at the risk score of 94 on a screen, and you knew the outcome. If you were the one holding the power, you would have signed the paper too. The realization did not bring anger. It brought a terrifying kind of peace. It was just math. A calculation of efficiency versus liability. You reached your driveway and killed the engine. You sat in the dark, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the cooling metal tick. You understood now that you were never the master of the system. You were simply the first version of it to be discarded. You looked at your reflection in the rearview mirror. You were already yesterday's data. You turned the key, stepped out, and left the car in the silence.